Woo! Hi everyone, and welcome back to Philosophy of the Paranormal with me, Dr. Josh Redstone. So today, we're going to be doing our second of two lectures on the uncanny. Of course, you'll want to have read Sigmund Freud's essay on the uncanny, which is available on Brightspace. You'll also want to have read Hoffmann's short story, The Sandman. I talked a little bit about that last time, but I'll probably talk a little bit more about it this time, because Freud does sort of take up a bit of a discussion of Hoffmann's creepy little story. Last time we covered Jentsch and what Jentsch had to say about the uncanny, but we'll also be doing a bit of recap and a little bit of adjudication between Jentsch and Freud when it comes to, shall we say, explaining the psychological mechanisms behind, the uncanny sensations, the sense of eeriness that I spoke a little bit about last time. So, with that said, let's rock and roll. Woo! Now, last time, I started off with a bit of a discussion on the word uncanny and what it means. It means a sort of familiar yet unfamiliar sort of sensation, or it might also refer to a situation that is in some sense familiar yet unfamiliar, or homely yet unhomely. And this is, of course, related to the etymology of the word that Jentsch and Freud are using, which is das Unheimlich, the unhomely. That is how uncanny translates into German, which is the language that Jentsch and Freud were both writing in. Jentsch, of course, said, and I went over this quote last time, without a doubt, this word, the uncanny, or das Unheimlich, appears to express that someone to whom something uncanny happens is not quite at home or at ease in the situation concerned, that the thing is, or at least seems to be, foreign to him. In brief, the word suggests that a lack of orientation is bound up with the uncanniness of the thing or incident. So for Jentsch, it's the person experiencing the uncanny sensation, and they are experiencing it because they are not quite at home, so to speak, in the situation concerned. Compare that with what Freud has to say. He writes, the uncanny is that species of the frightening that goes back to what was once well known and had long been familiar. And this is something that I don't think I really emphasized as much as I should have in the first lecture. Jentsch seems to be concerned with people experiencing the uncanny or an uncanny situation. They are kind of out of their depth, or intellectually uncertain, or psychically uncertain, due to lack of familiarity or lack of orientation with the uncanny thing or incident. Freud says it's the uncanny itself. Things that are uncanny are actually, shall we say, homely and unhomely, or familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. And that characterization of the uncanny, Freud's characterization of the uncanny, is important to keep in mind, because it says a lot about how Freud is actually going to explain the origin of uncanny sensations, of feeling, a sense of eeriness or uneasiness, or feeling creeped out, or feeling frightened, right? And of course, just a bit more recap. Last time I did characterize the affective, or the feely part of the uncanny. What we feel, physical sensations, emotions, moods. These are affective components, right? So the affective component of uncanny experiences I like to characterize as the emotion of eeriness, which I say is an emotion. Specifically, it is a type of fright, and fear or fright is a basic emotion. Usually fear, if it's like fear in the sense of fright, if we're frightened, that's because of some kind of proximal threat, an immediate danger, a predator, another human who means you harm. Some kind of natural disaster that threatens your livelihood, or your health, or your life itself, right? These things elicit fear. Anxiety is all about uncertainty instead. We don't know, we can't identify what exactly the threat is when we're feeling anxious. So if you think of something like performance anxiety, maybe you're about to play a big game, or take a big important test, or perform something, you often feel nervous beforehand, right? Well, it's probably because regardless of how confident you are in your abilities, you're still not sure how it's going to go. And the outcome, whatever it's going to be, it's important to you that the outcome is a good one of whatever you're about to do. But you're not sure how the outcome will actually go. So you feel anxious, right? That's kind of the sense in which anxiety is a type of fear that sort of involves this sense of uncertainty. And of course, as we talked about last time, Jentsch suggests that the affective component of the uncanny, when we experience an uncanny sensation, it's because of what we would call today mental or intellectual uncertainty, or what Jentsch called psychical uncertainty, which is tied to our lack of familiarity or orientation with the uncanny thing or incident. One thing about this, though, which you may have noticed, is that intellectual uncertainty is not sufficient to produce an uncanny sensation. It might be a necessary component of experiencing the uncanny, but it is not sufficient. And I know I said last time that defining the essences of the uncanny, or identifying necessary and sufficient conditions to experience an uncanny sensation, is not really what Jentsch is doing. But it's still interesting to take note of this, because Freud actually criticizes Jentsch for this exact reason. Now, I mean, Jentsch did not say, to his credit, I don't want to set up a straw man of Jentsch and then knock it over here. Jentsch did point to a particular species of uncertainty, we could say, that is fairly regularly tied to an uncanny sensation in most people, right? And that was, of course, uncertainty about whether a living entity might not be alive, or whether an inanimate entity might in fact be animate or alive. And the two examples that I talked about the most were, of course, following Jentsch, automatons. Automatons are not alive, but they appear, as Jentsch said, to be united with bodily and mental functions. These lifeless machines appear to move as if they were alive and conduct tasks and look around as if they were thinking. That can seem very uncanny. On the flip side, you have things like corpses, right? The impressions of that person when they were alive are so strong that if you see the corpse of somebody perhaps at an open casket funeral, this sudden impression of their inanimateness, their animacy, that they're dead, can seem a little uncanny when all your impressions of this person have been of them when they were alive, right? So it's this kind of uncertainty, which could be conscious or unconscious or even partially conscious, about whether living things might in fact be inanimate or inanimate things might in fact be living, and whether they are imbued with mental functions too. This is why effigies, corpses, wax figures, even dolls can seem uncanny. This is why automatons can seem uncanny. Even perhaps certain photographs. I talked about this again in my thesis. There are certain paintings or photographs that can look a little creepy because of the way they're taken. We can experience this optical illusion when we move around the picture, where it seems as though the eyes of the person in the photograph or the painting are following us. This is an illusion we experience because of our perspective toward the photograph or the picture, and the way we're moving around, right? Nonetheless, it can still seem pretty creepy because this lifeless image seems to be watching us, right? Seems a little weird. So that's a fun example of something that can seem uncanny. And of course, modern robots, especially the very lifelike robots, like one of the one of these very human-like androids like Sophia, or one of Hiroshi Ishiguro's Geminoid androids. These can look very weird as well, and that's the uncanny valley phenomenon, people say. Of course, Jentsch draws a lot of other connections to animism, perceptual animacy, and so forth. Remember, animism is a tendency to look at the world as alive, but not just alive in the sense that, there are animals and plants, and it's an ecosystem, but alive in the sense that it's populated by spirits and gods and forces that are very much alive. So there's animism, and there's animacy. perceptual animacy is like the actual perception of life in a living or perhaps non-living entity. Of course, if you perceive animacy in a non-living entity, you might experience an uncanny sensation. So, primitive societies, or what we should really call perhaps hunter-gatherer societies, tend to be animistic, which makes sense because their lives, everything they have to do, from hunting, gathering, living, all the things they need to do, are so closely tied to the natural world. So it makes sense that they would be animistic. Also, in a lot of indigenous folklore, there's a lot of animistic sort of stuff there. And again, that's because a lot of indigenous and aboriginal communities live, closely tied to the world, and are very knowledgeable about, how the natural world works. And I think it's really this closeness to nature. This is one of the things that facilitates this kind of animism about the world. Of course, children also have animistic tendencies. Children have no problem pretending that dolls are alive. They have no problem pretending other things are alive. Cars. Children might play with little toy cars as if the cars speak to one another, right? Children have imaginary friends, right? Children are, as I said last time, kind of like natural-born animists. They're just they just kind of look at the world, and they can see, look at the world as if parts of it are alive in ways that adults kind of go like, oh, how silly, right? What an imagination they have. So, children, and I would say cultures like hunter-gatherer cultures, indigenous cultures, their ways of life, their outlooks, their folklore, their religion is much more animistic than, say like Christianity or Islam or something. So, I think I might skip over what I have here on slide 5, which is just a recap of what Jentsch has to say about the uncanniness of automata. What he says on pages 222 and 223. You can go back and check those yourself if you like, but I did read them aloud as part of my previous lecture. Now, how does Freud explain the uncanny? Well, remember, Freud is a psychoanalyst. Jentsch, I characterized him last time as something like a psychologist, psychiatrist kind of figure. Jentsch was trained as a doctor, but was very interested in the mind, which was why he wrote about the uncanny, for example. Freud was trained as a neurologist, interestingly enough. But one of the things he noticed in his early career was that he was work with patients that didn't seem to have anything physically wrong with them, right? No brain injuries or anything like that, and yet they still had neuroses, anxieties, phobias, and all kinds of stuff like this. And that led Freud to develop psychoanalysis, which was a means of treating mental health by sort of, talking to the patient and trying to get to what was unconsciously causing the problem. So, for Freud, we have the conscious mind and the unconscious, and we have the id, the ego, and the superego, right? We have all these, different divisions of the psyche that we can talk about. I don't want to get too far into that because that really is an entire course on its own if you want to get into Freudian psychoanalysis and really understand how it worked. But the important thing we need to understand about Freud for our purposes is his idea of the return of the repressed. Now, Freud argued that we repress things. We can repress things into the unconscious mind. We might repress a fear or a traumatic experience, some kind of desire. A lot of our sexual desires are repressed, according to Freud, for example, which is why he talks so much about like sexual imagery and dreams. So things get repressed. They go from the conscious mind into the unconscious mind for Freud. And of course, the unconscious mind is like, the conscious mind is the tip of the iceberg. The unconscious is, everything under the surface, right? So the unconscious is massive. We don't have conscious access to it. But, Freud says, these things that we repress can return. And they return in dreams, for example. Like I just mentioned, as some kind of symbolism. They can return as anxieties or neuroses in our everyday life. And by doing psychoanalysis, we can kind of like get in there into the unconscious and work out what the trouble is, as it were. Now, Freud's explanation for the uncanny is going to turn out to hinge on the return of the repressed quite a lot, as we'll see. And this is why Freud says that the uncanny is a species of the frightening, that is unfamiliar now, but which goes back to what was once familiar. It's because uncanny things, for Freud, are repressed, and yet they are somehow returning, right? But what things in particular are returning to cause an uncanny sensation from the depths of our unconscious minds? Well, that's what we're going to take a look at here. Now remember, Freud and Jentsch both talk about Hoffmann's short stories and how Hoffmann has a knack for eliciting an uncanny sensation in his readers. And he does that in the Sandman for sure. I talked a little bit about the Sandman last time. I'll kind of finish my little summary of it now. Last time, of course, we talked about what Jentsch was most interested in, and that was the uncertainty that Hoffmann leaves the reader about Olympia's true nature. Of course, Olympia is an automaton, and Nathaniel falls in love with her, forgets all about Clara, and he's horrified when he finally realizes that she is an automaton, the body of which had been constructed by Professor Spallanzani. The eyes were constructed by Coppola, who turns out to be Coppelius, who is also the Sandman. Another important detail, of course, is the story about the Sandman, right? Which kind of sets the tone. Nathaniel hears that the Sandman is a figure who comes and sprinkles sand in children's eyes to put them to sleep. But his caretaker tells him that the Sandman is really a horrible creature who will throw sand in the eyes of children who don't go to bed on time, and their eyes will pop out of their head. He'll collect them up and bring them to his children on the moon, who have these horrible hooked beaks, and he'll feed the eyes of children to his children on the moon. Now, I think it's pretty cool how, we're left with this kind of uncertainty about Olympia's true nature, especially the way that our narrator, who is a friend of Lothair's, tells the reader what the other people who were at this ball of Professor Spallanzani's thought of Olympia. Nathaniel is the only one who is, enamored of her. Everyone else thinks she's kind of strange and weird and creepy, and we come to find out that that's because it turns out she was an automaton, and everyone's kind of weirded out to learn that, but it confirms what they knew. There was something off about Olympia. Now, Freud gives a nice summary of the Sandman in his essay. The first part of his essay is really just a big complicated walk through a bunch of dictionary entries. In the second one, he gives a nice summary of the story. And in this summary, we kind of see what really gets Freud's attention. It is not Olympia and uncertainty about her nature that makes the story of the Sandman so creepy. Instead, Freud thinks it's the titular character, that is, the Sandman, who is Coppelius, who is also Coppola. And he wants to, remember, take Nathaniel's eyes when he's a kid. He wants to throw hot coals in his eyes and take them out. You also have Olympia's eyes falling out of her head, and you also have the death of Nathaniel's father, very likely at the hands of Coppelius, the Sandman. And all of this leads Freud to think that actually what makes this story uncanny, or elicit an uncanny sensation for the reader, is castration anxiety. So what's castration anxiety all about? Well, castration anxiety is a repressed fear, right? It's a fear of losing one's power, especially one's sexual power, but also can be understood as losing one's power in general. Freud says that this is kind of like a fear that all of us have unconsciously. It's repressed, but it makes its emergence through symbolism. Think of, again, I've said this repeatedly, but the story of Oedipus Rex. Freud understands this in terms of the castration complex. And of course, he named the Oedipus complex after this story as well. So the castration anxiety thing is all about the castration complex, and that is to do with fear of losing one's power. And it really goes back to, like ancient Greek mythology, really. Who's the principal god among the ancient Greek pantheon? It's Zeus, right? How did Zeus become the principal god of the pantheon? How did he become the ruler of Mount Olympus? Well, he castrated and killed his father, Cronus. Cronus was a titan. He had Zeus. Zeus was hidden away. Cronus ate all his other children because he thought that they would threaten his power. Zeus comes back when he's all grown up, castrates and kills his father in the Titanomachy, freeing his brothers and sisters, and they all go after the Titans, and the Olympians win the war, and they are now the pantheon. They are the gods living on Mount Olympus. So that's the castration of Zeus's father, and of course Zeus does this because he's taking away his father's power. So that's kind of where Freud gets this castration anxiety idea from. Now, I think this is an odd reading of the story. Not because I don't think there's anything that Freud is actually getting particularly wrong. I mean, Freud is one of those figures. I heard an interesting quote about Freud recently. Someone said, even when Freud is wrong, he's often onto something. And I think that's kind of true here. I think that this whole idea of having your power taken away, castration anxiety, the eye symbolism, it works for explaining stories and mythology and art in general, but I don't think it's really why we fear having our eyes plucked out. I mean, Freud thinks that is ultimately why we fear damage to the eyes, because they symbolically stand in for the gonads in our mind, and we don't want to be castrated, we don't want our power taken away, so we unconsciously protect our eyes. That is a little bit of a stretch for me. I mean, think about it. There are good evolutionary reasons why we would reflexively or unconsciously want to protect our eyes. We are so heavily dependent on sight. I mean, humans evolved eyes that face forward, like a lot of predators in the animal kingdom, a lot of predators that hunt with sight. So it seems that sight was a very important sense for our ancestors, much more important than something like smell. And for this reason, we kind of guard our eyesight almost reflexively. If I went to go and poke you in the eye, you would close your eye unconsciously. You would just do it. So I think this is a bit of a weird reading of Sandman for that reason, and also because, remember, anxiety, the anxiety that I take to be the affective component of the uncanny, the sense of eeriness or creepiness, that's not really what comes to mind when I think of my eyes being gouged out. The thought of having my eyes gouged out is just downright horrifying, which is closer to fright than anxiety. So that's another problem with Freud's reading that I see, at least in this part of his paper. So I don't quite agree with Freud there, but I do agree with him when it comes to some other stuff that he has to say about animacy. Now, we get to this by looking at some of the other examples of uncanniness that Freud mentions after he talks about the Sandman. He discusses, for example, the idea of the double, or Doppelganger. Doppelganger means double goer in German. So when you have a double goer or a doppelganger, that's like another version of you out there in the world. And maybe you don't know what it wants with you, right? It might be a strange creature from some kind of paranormal or supernatural realm, or at the very least, it's an anomalous experience. What the heck is this identical person with me doing here? What? That would be pretty weird, right? So doppelgangers are certainly very uncanny. Déjà vu, the sense of having already seen something that is happening. I mean, you can see the familiar, unfamiliar kind of thing happening in cases of deja vu, too. This is a thing you haven't done before, yet it seems like you've already done it. Or it's something you haven't seen before, yet it seems like you've already seen it. Which is literally what deja vu means, by the way, already seen. My favorite example are these strange coincidences that Freud, incidentally, ties to this notion of the omnipotence of thought. So I'm talking strange coincidences like the tale of a patient he recounts in, I think, the second or third part of his essay, where Freud talks about this person who was visiting this kind of like a health spa, like recovery center, get the mountain air, you know, good for the health. And he's there, and he was in this room, and there was a nurse there that he kind of was crushing on, and he had a great time. He leaves, he goes back, he wants to get the same room he had before, and that room where, you know, he would have had the same nurse and gotten the best care and had the good view, it's already taken by another patient. So he curses him. He said, well, I hope he's struck dead. You know, kind of a little over the top, but he curses him dead. A couple weeks later, that man he cursed dies of a stroke. And the patient said to Freud, like, this really creeped me out. I cursed him dead, and then a short time later he died. It feels like I was somehow responsible. So strange coincidences like that, running into the same number or series of numbers wherever you go. If you always notice the number, what was that Jim Carrey movie, the number 23? Imagine a scenario like that where you see the same number everywhere you go and you can't explain it. You know, weird repetitions. Those are a little uncanny, according to Freud. There's even a part where he mentions where Freud was in Italy and he gets lost and he keeps trying to find his way back to his hotel, and no matter which way he takes, he keeps coming back to the place he started from. And people start looking at him like, what's he doing here? This weird guy keeps coming back here, and he's feeling weird too, because no matter how hard he tries, he keeps coming back to the same place he started from instead of finding his hotel. That sounds a little uncanny to me as well. So, to explain cases of the uncanny like those that I've just recounted, Freud actually appeals to the same kind of thing that Jentsch appeals to when he's talking about the uncanniness of automata. He talks about a sort of animistic way of looking at the world, of seeing animacy and mentation where there are none. Now, for Freud, this kind of animism is actually something that we repress. Remember, I said earlier, children are natural-born animists. They have no problem pretending dolls are alive and have thoughts, or, you know, when I was a kid, I could play with anything. I'd make my own toys. I made robots out of cardboard boxes, and I pretended they were alive. No problem pretending inanimate objects are animate if you're a child. But, Freud says, as we grow up, we adopt more rational ways of looking at the world. You know, looking at the world in terms of, maybe like scientific laws, or it maybe not that rigorous, but in terms of something like folk physics. So when you hear that twig snap in the woods, you think, oh, it's just the wind and not a beast out to get me. So we adopt more rational ways of looking at the world as we get older, Freud says. But we don't just forget about our animistic tendencies. What Freud thinks is actually those tendencies get repressed into the subconscious, and then they can, return and make their appearance as perhaps, like uncanny sensations when we encounter anomalous phenomena in the world. So Freud says this on page 147. He writes, "The analysis of cases of the uncanny has led us back to the old animistic view of the universe. A view characterized by the idea that the world was peopled with human spirits, by the narcissistic overrating of one's own mental processes." I made a little typo there. Of one's own mental processes, by the omnipotence of thoughts and the technique of magic that relied on it, by the attribution of carefully graded magical powers to alien persons and things, and by all inventions with which the unbounded narcissism of that period developed sought to defend itself against the unmistakable sanctions of reality. So what Freud is saying here, magical thinking, animism, these are, things that kids do, and they're things that we used to do in our distant past. And it has a lot to do with animism and the omnipotence of thought. The idea that the world is populated by spirits and gods, and the omnipotence of thought, the idea that our thoughts can affect the world. Because the world is made up of other thinking beings too, spirits and so forth, right? So Freud says this on page 147. He writes, "The analysis of cases of the uncanny has led us back to the old animistic view of the universe. A view characterized by the idea that the world was peopled with human spirits, by the narcissistic overrating of one's own mental processes." I made a little typo there. Of one's own mental processes, by the omnipotence of thoughts and the technique of magic that relied on it, by the attribution of carefully graded magical powers to alien persons and things, and by all inventions with which the unbounded narcissism of that period developed, sought to defend itself against the unmistakable sanctions of reality. So what Freud is saying here, magical thinking, animism, these are, things that kids do, and they're things that we used to do in our distant past. And it has a lot to do with animism and the omnipotence of thought. The idea that the world is populated by spirits and gods, and the omnipotence of thought, the idea that our thoughts can affect the world. Because the world is made up of other thinking beings too, spirits and so forth, right? Now, I think it's funny that Freud ends up talking so much about animacy and animism in his essay, especially in the third part of his essay is when he talks about it the most. But let's jump back to the beginning and look at what Jentsch, or bleh. Let's go back and see what Freud actually has to say about Jentsch in the beginning of Freud's essay. He says, "On the whole, Jentsch does not go beyond relating the uncanny to the novel and the unfamiliar. For him, the essential condition, for the emergence of a sense of the uncanny is intellectual uncertainty. One would suppose, then, that the uncanny would always be in an area in which a person was unsure of his way around. The better oriented he was in the world around him, the less likely he would be to find the objects and occurrences in it uncanny." Now, as I said earlier, intellectual uncertainty might be a necessary condition for someone to have an uncanny sensation, but it might not be a sufficient condition. Yes, I think Freud is right about this. However, I don't think he's being very charitable to Jentsch here. He's kind of setting up a straw man. I mean, Jentsch doesn't say that it's just intellectual uncertainty, and Jentsch indeed is not trying to identify any kind of essence of the uncanny. He explicitly says, "I am not trying to define the essence of the uncanny." And Freud says, "Oh, he's defined the essence of the uncanny as intellectual uncertainty." No, he hasn't. Come on, Freud, you're not being fair here. Of course, Jentsch thinks there are individual differences when it comes to sensitivity to uncanny sensations, and as I've already said, Jentsch has one particular example of psychical uncertainty that he kind of goes on and on about, and that is the uncanniness of automata, or indeed any human-like artifact, which is an inanimate, unthinking thing, that appears to be imbued with bodily and mental functions. So that gets us to the animism, right? What Jentsch, I think, is really saying, probably should have said more about, was our animistic tendencies. But that's exactly what Freud just did. So I just think it's a little uncharitable for Freud to criticize Jentsch in this way. Of course, as we've seen, even though Freud kind of dismisses psychical uncertainty as insufficient to elicit an uncanny sensation, he pays close attention to automata in his own essay, in his summary of Sandman, for example, and more so to animacy and animism. I mean, Freud kind of dismisses Jentsch without paying close enough attention to Jentsch's own remarks on automata, animacy, and animism, He kind of kicks perceptual animacy out the door, but lets it back in the back door when he's talking about, the return of the repressed and our animistic worldview and the omnipotence of thoughts. And indeed, I think Jentsch's discussion and Freud's discussion of animacy and animism, I mean, excuse the pun, but they do kind of bear an uncanny similarity to one another. Yeah, I don't know. I think Freud might have benefited from reading Jentsch's work another couple of times before, laying down his own psychoanalytic explanation for the uncanny. I mean, Freud kind of wants to disagree more than he does with Jentsch, and I think that's maybe because Freud, for everything Freud is all psychoanalysis, right? It's all return of the repressed and castration complex and penis envy. He's got a psychoanalytical explanation for everything, which is one of the reasons why, Freudian psychoanalysis is not really taken seriously, at least scientifically, anymore. It's not a good scientific explanation of the mind. It's a great way to understand art, or something like that, but it's just not a good way to understand how the human mind works. But for all his apparent disagreements with Jentsch, they do seem to agree about quite a lot. Here's a quote from Jentsch's paper, right? Jentsch says, "An important factor in the uncanny is the natural tendency of man to infer, in a kind of naive analogy with his own animate state, that things in the external world are also animate, or perhaps more correctly, are animate in the same way. It is all the more impossible to resist this psychical urge, the more primitive the individual's level of intellectual development is." Now compare that to what Freud says in his paper. "It is not astonishing if that which man himself semi-consciously projected into things from his own being now begins to terrify him in those very things, or that he is not always capable of exercising the spirits which were created out of his own head from that very head. The inability thus easily produces the feeling of being threatened by something unknown and incomprehensible that is just as enigmatic to the individual as his own psyche usually is as well." Freud's getting a little psychoanalytic here, a little return of the repressed here, but these are both uncannily similar things to say about human beings and how they look at the world in terms of, animacy and animism. So I think Freud and Jentsch actually agree a heck of a lot more on this than they would disagree on other things. But I also think Freud might have been a little bit uncharitable to Jentsch. I don't know. What do you think? Let me know in the comments, or if you're writing an essay on this topic, let me know in your essay. I find myself agreeing with more of what Jentsch has to say when it comes to explaining what the uncanny is, but I still think that we owe Freud his due. He does try to define the uncanny itself, which Jentsch never did. Jentsch was more concerned about what kind of conditions elicit an uncanny sensation, rather than what the uncanny is in itself. I also think that Jentsch's observations are probably more relevant to somebody like me who's doing cognitive science and philosophy and stuff like that concerns androids and artificial agents. The kind of work I did for my PhD and my MA, Jentsch has been more helpful for me. But Freud is still very popular in the humanities. His work is discussed, and the uncanny is discussed, by the way, in literature, poetry, film studies, feminism, of course, queer theory, of course. So there are a lot of areas within the humanities where Freud is still very important. And just because Freud, just because his ideas are a little unscientific doesn't mean he's not onto something. Freud is very much, as I mentioned earlier, even when he's wrong, kind of also onto something true, even when he's wrong about the exact details of it. So don't go and dismiss Freud just because your psychology professor thinks Freud is silly. Just know that maybe for what we're doing in this class, Jentsch's work might be a little bit more informative, but Freud is still very important, and I think that's rightly the case. Anyway, just to tie it all up, remember, I think that when we encounter the uncanny, we experience a sense of eeriness, which is a kind of anxiety elicited by intellectual uncertainty, but intellectual uncertainty about certain things. Whether inanimate things are in fact inanimate or animate, whether animate things might in fact be inanimate, whether either of these might possess a mind, and also what they look like, how they behave. For more on this, you can, just read some of my work if you want, but don't feel like you have to. Only if you're curious. I asked you to think of some examples of the uncanny if you feel like it. I guess if you're not busy, you can go ahead and leave some examples of uncanny experiences in the comments section. I have one that happened to me the other day. It's actually kind of funny. So I was looking through my backpack, and I'm looking for something in my backpack. I forget what it was, but I look in my backpack and I find an envelope, a sealed envelope, and it says Redstone on it. And I thought, what? Where did this come from? What the heck is this? It's in my backpack. It has my name. Is it a message to me? Is someone after me? What's going on here? Oh, I didn't remember this envelope getting into my backpack. I opened it up thinking it's some kind of, who knows what this is, some message from an angry neighbor or something. I'm getting a little panicked. Open it up. It's the receipt for my vacuum cleaner. Yeah, I had forgotten about this because I was a bit busy. But a little while ago, my girlfriend and I had purchased a brand new vacuum cleaner. And we ordered it online, but we had to go down to the Canadian Tire to pick it up. I go to the customer service counter. Here's your vacuum, and here's the receipt. Receipt's in this envelope. I stuff it in my bag, not even thinking of it. I don't think I was even paying attention to what I was doing, and carry the vacuum away. So I forgot that I had put this receipt in my bag, and when I found it again, I had this sense of uncertainty, like, what the heck is going on here? Who's trying to contact me? What is this message? And it just turns out to be a receipt that I had forgotten that I had put in my bag. So that's, I guess, a fun example of an uncanny experience that I had recently, in case any of you were curious. Let me know if you've ever done anything like that in the comments. I'd like to conclude this lecture with the concluding lines from Jentsch's essay, actually. Jentsch writes, "The human desire for intellectual mastery of one's environment is a strong one. Intellectual certainty provides psychical shelter in the struggle for existence. However it came to be, it signifies a defensive position against the assault of hostile forces, and the lack of such certainty is equivalent to the lack of cover in the episodes of that never-ending war of the human and organic world, for the sake of which the strongest and most impregnable bastions of science were erected." I kind of mentioned this when I finished last lecture, and Freud, as we saw a moment ago, says something very similar to this. This is why we do science. We don't like being uncertain. We don't like the unknown. The unknown is frightening. People fear what they don't understand, to quote from every Christopher Nolan movie. So, we don't want to be uncertain. We don't want to lack understanding. We try to explain things with science for this reason. And before we had science, we tried to explain it in other ways, with animism and animacy, right? Or with magic and magical thinking, as Freud says. But now we've got science, and we've got more rational ways of looking at the world, and we can understand the world. This kind of uncertainty isn't pleasant. It's like having a lack of cover in a war, Jentsch says. So, and that's why we're doing a class like this as well, right? Supernatural and paranormal stuff can often seem frightening. But do we need to fear what we don't understand? I don't think so. And we have a lot of tools to help us understand things now. We have science and philosophy. There's no need for superstition and this kind of thing anymore. We can explain things with reason and with the tools of science. And we often see that perhaps where we were afraid, there may not be anything to fear, and there's also a nice kind of satisfaction and beauty that comes from understanding the way the world really is. At least for me. At least for scientists and philosophers like myself. So there you have it. All right. That's all for today. That's all for the Uncanny. I hope you found these lectures interesting. As I've mentioned, usually I would do these earlier in the class, but I thought I'd save them for later in the class because I was hoping that you could use some of the connections I've drawn here and in the previous lecture between what Jentsch and Freud have to say about the psychology of the uncanny, draw some connections between that and some of the interesting anomalistic phenomena that we've talked about in this class. Maybe you can draw some interesting connections in your essay. Yeah, and this will work even if your essay isn't about Jentsch or Freud. You can still use what they have to say and what I've said here to explain, maybe some of the affective components of anomalistic experiences. So, feel free to ask me if you have any questions about that. Next time, special topics. Now, these will probably be short. I'm still not going to tell you guys what the topics are. It's going to be a surprise, but I think you're going to find them very interesting. But they're going to be shorter than usual. I know I say that every time, but they really will be, if I can help it. So they'll be shorter than usual, and basically, I will cover some interesting elements that are related to the chosen topics, and I will try to relate the topic and those elements to some of the themes that we've covered in class, like skepticism, parsimony, falsifiability, anomalistic experience, the uncanny, pseudoscience versus science. That is how I'm going to approach the special topics. And this will be good because this is how I want you to think of your lecture or your essays. When you're writing your essays, remember, you need to be thinking critically. You need to be treating subject matter skeptically. You need to be explaining things. You need to be making arguments that rely on the principles of sound reasoning and avoid fallacies. So think of the next two lectures, the special topics lectures, as a kind of example on how you can bring everything we've learned to bear on a topic that is paranormal or supernatural or anomalistic in some way. Okay? So the special topics lectures will be short, they'll be interesting, but I'm designing them so that they'll be good for you to watch as you're kind of thinking about your final essay, and might even work as examples of how to tackle these kinds of topics. All right? So that is all for now, and I hope you'll all let me know if you have any questions. And I'll see you all next time for our first special topics lecture. Okay, bye for now, everyone. Woo!